Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to join us today, and welcome to IISS. South Sudan, the world's youngest nation, is no stranger to peace deals. It's seen a number of them struck, and yet peace itself still remains much more of an idea on paper than a reality on the ground. What is it truly going to take to make peace in South Sudan? There's obviously no easy answers to this question, but today we have an excellent panel who I hope can shed some light on what's gone wrong so far and what might be able to be done differently. We have Mr. Tim Morris, the former British ambassador to South Sudan, who was posted to Juba between 2015 and 2017. Dr. Andrew Chi is the research fellow at IISS's Conflict, Security and Development Programme, and he was previously in the Civil Affairs Department of the UN Mission to South Sudan. Nina Pauls is the Assistant Research Analyst in Conflict, Security and Development, and she specialises in Sudan, South Sudan and the broader Horn of Africa. So if I may, we'll begin with a recap of South Sudan's history so far, and Nina, I think you're going to begin.
Thank you very much, Nella. So South Sudan's civil war started in December 2013, only 2 years after its independence from Sudan in 2011. Tensions in the ruling Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the SPLM, led to the split of the SPLM into the faction led by President Salva Kiir and the SPLM in opposition, the SPLM-IO faction, led by Riek Machar. While the conflict is often portrayed as a result of clashes between Machar's Nuer tribe and Kiir's Dinka tribe, this dichotomy would be too simplistic to explain the conflict, where alliances frequently shift, cutting across ethnic lines. So in 2013, as violence spread throughout the country, killing thousands of people, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, the international community, back then in particular the United States, attempted various times to negotiate a peace deal between the fighting parties. In August 2015, the parties signed a peace agreement which collapsed again 1 year later upon Machar's return to Juba. Upon his return, fighting broke out between Machar's forces and Kiir's troops in Juba. The fighting again quickly spread through all of Sudan, this time also reaching the central equatorial regions in the south as the SPLM-IO gradually moved to the south into the DRC. It's also during this period, from 2016 to 2018, that we can observe an increased fragmentation in the armed opposition against the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, as is marked by an increase in breakaway factions and newly established armed groups. So within this splintered security landscape, Sudan and Uganda once again brokered a revitalized peace agreement, which was signed on 12 September 2018. However, of this new peace agreement, some active groups are not part of it, most notably the National Salvation Front, led by Thomas Cirillo, and the South Sudan United Front under Paul Malong. The peace agreement provides for an 8-month pre-transitional period, which will be upon the end of the pre-transitional period, the transitional government will be formed. The transitional government is expected to stay in power for 3 years, and then by the end of these 3 years, elections will take place. So the initial deadline for the formation of a transitional government, which would mark the end of the pre-transitional period, was 12 May 2019. However, early May, the parties agreed that they couldn't meet this deadline, so the deadline was moved to 12 November 2019, roughly a month ago. Once again, the deadline was postponed with 100 days. So as of now, there's 74 days left to the next deadline for the formation of a transitional government. And within this conflict brief, we will really discuss what caused these delays and what the way forward is going to be.
Terrific, thank you. Tim, I'd like to sort of bring you in here at this point. Reflecting on the time that you spent in Juba a few years ago, is this an outcome we could have envisaged? Have any of these developments surprised you?
I think the simple answer is no. That this was the whole process which began after the great failure and the clash of 2013. The process of re-establishing peace and re-establishing political unity was always going to take a very long time. I think there's a lot to be said, and we might discuss a little bit about what that peace agreement actually looked like, and whether it was exactly the right way to do things. But the pattern of behaviour and the difficulty of coming together has been a theme. It's been very difficult to identify breakthrough moments when the contesting parties have actually changed their approach or changed their behaviour. It's been a zero-sum game. So, looking back on it, I think in many ways one of the crucial things which could have been done differently would have been to establish some rules about the transitional government. In other words, as applies in some other countries where they go into that situation, the transitional government is composed of people who are then not going to be part of the following government. In other words, they're there transitionally. That principle was never established. But it's very easy to be wise after the event. What was clearly necessary, and because of the way the international community works and the particular history of the support for South Sudan in the region and in the international community, inevitably there was going to be an agreement around putting together this type of process. So I'm not surprised, but that doesn't mean to say that I believe for a minute that the machinery which has been agreed should somehow be jettisoned. I think that would just play into the hands of people who want further delay.
I see. And you mentioned that you had some opinions on the peace agreement itself and whether or not, in retrospect, that had been the right way to go. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more?
We constantly debated this, both in Juba and in capitals and in fora like this. And I think the tension is between a sort of ideal situation where people sit down with a clean sheet of paper and they design perfection, and a reality about how the international system works, and indeed about the parties involved, which means that if we involve them, if the international community involves the parties on the ground, then of necessity it's going to lead to a rather overcomplicated agreement, which in many ways has got too much in it. I mean, it's trying to achieve lots of different things at the same time. It's trying to actually draw the lines of a new country, as well as just stopping people fighting. But I would take the view that it was necessary to do it like that. That the idea of being sequential, to say we will do one thing and then we'll do something else, and these phrases which are bandied around saying you can't possibly do this until you've done that, for me would have been a recipe for disaster. That would have left zero discussion of broader issues and it being totally stuck. So I think broadly it's been the right thing to just keep insisting on this process, to be for the partners and indeed the friends of South Sudan, people of all of us who want the country to succeed. It's been very important to be consistent and be knowledgeable and be watchful. There are undoubtedly those who are looking for opportunities to stop the process. It's not a difficult thing to do. It's been displayed by a number of leaders in South Sudan. You can stop the clock quite quickly. It doesn't require a huge intellectual effort. You just don't cooperate. You can collapse it temporarily. And even though that happens, it doesn't stop it being the right thing to do, to aerate all these issues, and to fund the mechanisms and staff the mechanisms of it, so that the best result for the people of South Sudan, which after all is presumably the most important thing for all of us, is, I firmly believe, is an international system there which is on the case, which is genuinely trying to support. Not to interfere in everything. Of course, this is a sovereign country, and decisions need to be taken by South Sudanese leaders themselves. But at the same time, a part of the tragedy has been that the country had this high level of expectation about functionality when it got its independence, which frankly was not reflected by reality. And I think we can all castigate ourselves about that, but that's the truth.
Absolutely. Andrew, do you have anything to add to that? I know you had some opinions about the initial peace agreement itself. Is there anything you wish had been done differently looking back?
I mean, I think for me, I do agree with what Tim has obviously put forward, but I do think there was partly on the international community side, a lack of understanding the context of South Sudan, understanding the historical context when it comes to how this country had evolved, the systems that were in place or had been eroded from the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, some of that through the SPLA, and how that impacted beyond the CPAs. And I think those lessons for me are probably one of the crucial things that I think the international community didn't really pay much attention to and should have. And even now, the current situation, you still see the same mistakes. Everyone focuses on 2013, but no one actually focuses on beyond what happened and how that has led to where we are today. And what we're in. I mean, most people have commented, but we are mostly in a position where people are trying to deal with what we call sort of a negative peace, so just diffusing the situation, as opposed to dealing with the root causes of the conflict that have prolonged where we are today.
Oh, I see. Okay, so we've got clearly now we have a peace agreement which may not be perfect, but it's the one that we are working with. However, we've also seen so many delays to its implementation. So let's take a closer look at these. Nina, if I could begin with you, and maybe you can bring us through the security realities on the ground and what that's meant for implementation.
I think there are really three security factors that has contributed to the constant extension of the pre-transitional period and the continued insecurity on the ground. To quickly summarize them up before delving deeper into them, first of all, I think it's the continued fighting in several parts of South Sudan, especially between the holdout groups and the government forces. Secondly, the lack of progress on the cantonment process. And third, the security arrangements in Juba that have not been put in place yet for Riek Machar's return to the city. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, during the negotiation on the peace agreement, several groups did not end up signing the peace agreement, but two of them remain very active up until today, being the National Salvation Army led by Thomas Cirillo and the South Sudan United Front under Paul Malong. Thomas Cirillo was part of the negotiations, but left the negotiation table in August 2018 and has refused to enter into negotiations with the government since, unless they open up the entire peace agreement for renegotiations. So we've seen a lot of clashes between government forces and the holdout groups. We have a video that records if it can play. The armed clashes and violent incidents from 12 September, so the signing of the peace agreement, to 12 November 2019, which was the last deadline for the transitional government. Here we can clearly see a concentration of violence in the south central Equatoria region. That's the region where the National Salvation Front, led by Thomas Cirillo, clashed several times with the state forces and the SPLM-IO troops that was still stationed there. Violence here really peaked in January and February 2019. The UN reported that in this period from September 2018 to April 2019, in total 104 civilians were killed, 56,000 people were internally displaced, and over 19,000 people fled into neighboring Uganda and Democratic Republic of Congo. Other hotspots of violence during this period include in the northwest, western Bahr el Ghazal, where South Sudan United Front forces clashed with government forces, especially in August 2019. And in Warraba Lake states, we see also a concentration of violence, and this is mainly communal violence and cattle raids that continue to form a large source of instability in the country. Having said this, the ceasefire that was signed between the parties signatory to the revitalized peace agreement has largely held, which led to a huge decrease in clashes between the SPLM and SPLM-IO. Nonetheless, late November, a UN report found that the government forces continued their recruitment. In Warab State, they were reported to have recruited 10,000 forces outside the peace agreement, and similar accusations have been leveraged against the SPLM-IO throughout the past year as well. So the second point with regard to the insecurity in Sudan, which we have this table for. So this table discusses the status of the implementation of the pre-transitional tasks. So the tasks that were supposed to be met prior to moving to the transitional period. In yellow, we can see the cantonment of forces signatory to the revitalized peace agreement. And I think the second point really relates to that. So besides the continued fighting, the cantonment process and registration of forces has consistently been delayed due to a lack of both financial resources but also political commitment. The cantonment and registration of all fighters in 35 sites across South Sudan is supposed to create to the unification of 80,000 forces, which is a massive army for a country that only has a population of 11 million. But little progress has been made on the cantonment. On 5 December, so only a few days ago, the body monitoring the implementation of South Sudan Peace Agreement, the SDSAMVN, said that the lack of basic commodities at the cantonment site really threatens the process, and further difficulties were caused during the rainy season when many streets and roads flooded, so services couldn't be transported to the cantonment sites. Several cantonment sites are also reported to be deserted again because fighters came, registered, and there were no provisions in place, so they left. So there's not really a great progress on the cantonment, which is also a precondition before moving to the actual transitional period. So lastly, I think the third factor, not enough attention has been paid to putting in kind the right security provisions in Juba to facilitate Machar's return. He's currently residing in Khartoum in Sudan. A special VIP protection unit within the army was supposed to ensure both his safety and of Salva Kiir upon his return to Juba. But Machar has demanded that 1,400 of the forces within the VIP protection unit should come from his own SPLM-IO forces. And this kind of creates a risk of a 2016-like scenario where parties mobilize the mobilization of forces along party lines within the protection forces really create again a risk of clashes continuing between SPLM-IO forces and forces loyal to Salva Kiir. So overall, with regards to the security provisions, challenges and risks resulting from a combination of flaws inherent to the peace agreement and a lack of resources remain. I think they're unlikely to be resolved in the 74-day window left until moving to the transitional period. The government would really have to demonstrate significant economic and political engagement to the process to progress on the implementation. Especially financially. Earlier this year, President Kiir committed $100 million to the implementation of the pre-transitional arrangements. However, so far only $40 million has been released, and there has been little transparency about where this money was spent. I think the release of all the funding, the full $100 million, is crucial, and also increased transparency on where the money is spent. This would also really increase donors' trust, who so far have been very hesitant to fund the peace agreement in South Sudan.
Great, thank you. And Tim, back to you. As someone who's seen a lot of behind-the-scenes politics in South Sudan, what do you imagine the key kind of political obstacles are to the present peace agreement being implemented?
Well, if it's anything like it was from up to when I left in 2017, there's a fundamental lack of trust. And I think I would love to hear that is changing and those behaviours are changing. The addition of a couple of more than two political parties and players since then would have complicated things. The discussion around DDR basically and around recruitment and the various stages of DDR and the cantonment process was profoundly flawed for a long time, and it was being played with really by the parties. It was on the one hand a sort of a plea for resources from donor countries, which was not forthcoming, because actually the requirements for food were quite possible to meet through local resources. But what was evident was a lack of trust there to actually make those things happen. So I think we must all profoundly hope that by keeping on with these processes and these discussions, there will come points where there is a bit of progress. There will perhaps be extraneous factors or changes of personality, for example, which might help people make concessions, and it's very important to do. But I think we in our own analysis we have to look beyond that and think through why it is that people are behaving in this way. I think that there's a lot of history, as we've discussed, and history of animosity, vengeance, and a lot of psychology behind that around guilt and pain that all parties have faced, which made it clear, certainly for those first few years, and let's pray that this changes, that people were not ready. They were not ready to make concessions. There was also a thing which I insisted on, which is quite difficult as a thought process to actually sort of explain through the diplomatic system, which I was convinced that many, a huge part of the population, but also parts of the leadership actually were mentally very much affected through a form of post-traumatic stress syndrome, through trauma. And their behaviours were demonstrated. And I found, as ambassador there, talking to the various leaders, there were those who were traumatised and those who were not. And we talked about this very openly. And some most certainly were. And some of the people who are main protagonists in this were suffering. And I'm not saying that, I am saying that with a certain amount of sympathy, but I'm also saying it as an observable fact. And what I'm told by experts is that if you suffer from these things, then your instincts pull you towards the short term. It's around self-protection. And so long-term strategy becomes the last thing you want to talk about. I saw those behaviours being demonstrated, and I would just love to think that they're being addressed. So I think there are things behind these questions where the outside observer, and Andrew said very perceptively, I mean, that too little time is spent unpicking the history of actually what happened in the last 50 years, certainly, in the country, where you had a generation who will have spent their lifetimes in war and in rivalry and in unresolved fights, basically, with neighbours. And that was something which the international community sort of looked past. But this isn't, this is just it's a sort of inevitable feature. If you look to international mechanisms, whether they're regional, and our regional colleagues would tend to have a much greater knowledge of the history and the individuals. But if you use international mechanisms work as mechanisms. They don't necessarily get themselves into the underlying psychological and cultural elements of why this situation is it is. And it is a very, very special conflict and a very unresolved one. So there was always a feeling sitting in that room when we were all there together with the parties and going through the terms of the peace agreement, usually in a very fractious and quite negative way. There was always a feeling that there are other things, other issues outside the room, behind us, which were dominating people's behaviour. I don't want to be totally negative. I mean, there will come a time when people will be able to move on. And we all profoundly hope that, because of the effect, the potentially positive effect it could have on people. I think it's terribly worrying. There is still conflict going on across the country. We watched this process, after all, since 2013. Even by the time I left, there were 400,000 people that died. And the responsibility everyone felt and should feel for that was extraordinary. But there were some leaders who visibly were unaffected by it, which I would take as a function of their own psychological state. And I think there is a point where you can't just be rude about people and say that they're bad people. That's the immediate instinct. But there really was a genuine difficulty for the leaders in actually grasping the scale and the complexity of their own problem, and that's what's got to change to move this along. Otherwise, I worry that most of these things are merely tactical. They're sub-tactical moves. They're just small ways of keeping critics quiet.
Well, that's fascinating, thank you. So Andrew, kind of with what Nina and Tim have just said in mind, what are your list of recommendations for getting things going? What would you like to see to try and drive this peace process forward?
Well, I think there are probably three. I mean, there's several things you could do, but I'll probably list three that I think are important. I think the first thing is there needs to be more accountability from the parties that are guarantors of the agreement. We know the issue with Sudan, given the ousting of Bashir, but again, Uganda and Sudan playing more of a pivotal role is really important, because not just because of the historical links, but also because they are guarantors of this agreement. I think there needs to be, as Tim has alluded to, better mechanisms when it comes to reintegration. So it's not just saying, okay, we're going to form the 83,000 troops. It's how do you do that? How do you implement that? How do you go about making sure that these groups or the various people within this national army are unified? That's not going to happen in 100 days. It's not going to even happen in a year. It will take several decades to get there. And so I think that comes to my third point, is being realistic. And with being realistic, it also means looking at, and in my own opinion, discounting or putting away the idea of elections, and saying, actually, if we form this thing in a year's time, we have a transitional government unity, we can go for elections. This, for me, I think is a very given the fragility, given the issues that Tim has raised and Nina has raised as well, I think going to elections straight away would be a disaster, when it would only emphasise the problems of what we've seen before, particularly within the various camps. So I think moving away from that and looking at more, how do we strengthen the capacity of local groups, how do we strengthen the capacity of a sort of a transitional unity government, but also society, and how do we reconcile the differences, the issues, the violence, justice, all of these things, I think are really the most important thing that I'd like to see. I mean, there are other things that we can talk about, but I think those are the things that I think need to be done and worked on.
Oh, I see. And Nina, what can you tell us about the humanitarian consequences of everything that's happened so far?
So, as the ceasefire between the parties signatory to the revitalized peace agreement has largely held, IDPs and refugees have also slowly started to return to their hometowns. However, throughout 2019, we've seen reports emerge of the lack of facilities and services provided for the returnees to rebuild their livelihoods again. Additionally, continued fighting in other parts of South Sudan has caused renewed displacement. So the number of South Sudanese refugees has remained at 2.2 million, which is largely the same as in 2018. So as you can see on the map behind me, most South Sudanese refugees have fled into Uganda and Sudan. The number of IDPs within Sudan remains at 1.5 million, which is a slight decrease from the 2 million in 2018. However, according to the UN, this decrease reflects a review and verification of previously collected data rather than an actual decrease in the number of IDPs. So while people indeed did start to return, continued violence in parts of South Sudan, especially the hotspots as we showed earlier, and here again indicated with the red dots, caused renewed displacements. In Central Equatoria alone, between September 2018 and April 2019, 56,000 civilians were displaced. Additionally, 7 million people, which is over half the population of 11 million in South Sudan, are in need of humanitarian aid. The improved security situation in South Sudan has improved humanitarian access in areas that were previously affected by the conflicts. Nevertheless, in July and August, there were quite a lot of reports of incidents affecting the delivery of humanitarian aid. The UN reported 79 incidents. So this still makes it quite a high-risk country for the delivery of humanitarian aid. Overall, South Sudan remains very aid-dependent, as more than half of its population is in need of humanitarian aid. And despite a decrease in violence and improvement in the overall humanitarian situation compared to 2019 is marginal. The biggest improvement in 2019 is really the humanitarian access, but logistical issues, especially caused by the heavy rains during the rainy season, have again posed significant challenges to the delivery of aid and also increased the need of humanitarian aid.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to ask you very quickly as we wrap up, now that we have this 100-day delay, where do we go from here, and is there anything you want to see, particularly the international community or any particular local actors doing? And Tim, we can start with you.
Okay. I think and I think Andrew was touching on this, I think the regional leaders and the shape of IGAD has slightly changed with Sudan chairing it. But I think the IGAD leadership has a huge responsibility. They are the leaders of the process, and they are the leaders who are capable of getting hold of the leaders of South Sudan individually and pressurizing them. They have a unique ability to do that. I would argue it's a stronger message, and there's a much more of a chance of success for them to do it rather than anyone else in the world. The history of that has been shifting, shall we say, that I personally was never a conspiracy theorist about this. My observation was always that countries have their own problems, and there were moments when a particular neighbouring government had its own internal issues to deal with, and that meant a slackening of the pressure. The 2 years I was there, I don't think I can think of a single time when all the IGAD leaders came to Juba. And it would have been good to have them there, coming and actually taking a strong line, and a supportive line as well, but some level of political compulsion. For the wider international community, and to single out the Troika, the UK with the US, Norway and the European Union, we have a continuing role in supporting IGAD. That was a thing which held extremely well. That relationship was very, very strong. Our US friends had enormous amount of politics invested in this, which this is a separate discussion, but that has developed over time and due to political pressures back at home. But for the UK and Norway particularly, I think we are consistent in that, but we're also consistent in having a limited role too. There are things we can't lead on or take control of. The UN is absolutely vital. It is in two respects, as you all know. I mean, both in the UN presence on the ground, which I would argue has become more effective over the years. It was an extraordinarily difficult challenge for the UN on the ground in converting their operation after 2013. The UN doesn't convert very quickly because it has 192 members and mandates need to be changed, and that takes months, and certain countries have their agendas to undermine that process. So that took a long time to change, but it has changed, and they do a brave and decent job on the ground. The UN Security Council in New York, who are always absolutely convinced of their primacy over world affairs. And I'm a former head of our UN department in the Foreign Office, and I always got a little bit of amusement out of this because, some issues in the world are really difficult, and then there's South Sudan. The idea that some of the really big global issues really can be advanced by the Security Council when it's working together. But Security Council resolutions as applied to South Sudan, one of the dear foreign minister in South Sudan who didn't know what Chapter 7 was. You've got quite a struggle. As I said, Minister, your country is subject to Chapter 7 action. So there's a certain reality check sometimes needed by our colleagues in New York. And when they rock up to Juba, they always seem to be wearing New York clothes, sort of evening dresses and things. But I'm joking a bit. I mean, that obviously the Security Council taking a very strong and consistent line has been really important. So we just need to keep going. I think keep watch, keep engaged, and keep our faith.
Great. Andrew and Nina, if I could ask you for your same thoughts, but quite quickly, please, so we can get to questions.
So I think for mine, just quickly, I think there are 5, we can't really see it properly, 5 key points. One is really the security aspect, which is this is the number of what we call counter-raiding incidents from 2017 to 18. And if you look at over a different period, you actually see an increase. So I think for me, the focus on security is going to be crucial because as people withdrew or come away from various groups and they demobilize into towns and local areas, this will increase and you might see more violent conflicts between communities. And so getting a grip on this is really important. So within that, then that's sort of the larger thing, security, how you deal with NAS and NAS-TC. You've got the regional politics, I think, which is also important. A lot of countries have elections next year. How are you going to deal with that? Looking at the flaws within the actual current agreement as well, which is really a copy and paste, which has weaker mechanisms, corruption, and I would say 2 other points, which is really, one, how do we avoid prolonging the conflict, which I think we've, to the degree the international community has played a role in doing, and how do international donors erode the local capacity as well, going forward.
I agree with all that Tim and Andrew just have mentioned as well. I think I would like to add there that it's really important to, currently a lot of talk in South Sudan about this to resolve the internal border issues. So how many states are going to be established, what are the borders going to be? It's important to really solve that issue within the pre-transitional period instead of pushing it to the transitional period, because then we're just pushing forward and postponing a really important issue over which conflict could emerge. And secondly, I also think it's important to really, however flawed it is, to acknowledge the gains of the peace agreement and the ceasefire that has largely held between the SPLM and the SPLM-IO.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Ewan Grant, I've worked in UN and World Bank development programs in the Horn of Africa and in the East African community, but not in South Sudan, unlike my colleague here who certainly has. My question, it's 2 questions. Where do you see going forward the strengths of the UN inside the country? Andrew, of course, has worked there, and the ambassador said quite a lot of people from New York come wearing New York clothes. And the second point is regarding external actors, including 2 UN Security Council members, and natural resources. Where are the key natural resources of the country outside the oil industry? Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll go across the panel, beginning with Tim, if we may.
Okay. As I said, I think the UN is essential in country. as a standard setter, as a provider of a particular type of peacekeeping, which involves protecting IDPs. As you know, it's the only UN operation in the world which does this. And for the peculiar and very tragic reasons of the original conflict, that role continues, and it saves lives. And for whatever criticism the UN may have come under at the time, it most certainly saved hundreds of thousands of lives. I think certainly in programs to an extent, but it has lived through the challenge of, and I think it's probably won the argument now, that it's not seen as just a provider. There was a temptation, it was amply exploited by the leadership to try to look at the UN as a provider. It provides a level, but what it does provide is a level of standard setting and a level of, in a way, a level of government in a country which is very, very fragile. That I see continuing for the time being. On natural resources, of course, this is dominated by the discussion on oil and the various concerns around that, around non-transparent dealings on oil, around getting the industry back up and going. The Chinese have an important involvement in that. I used to work closely with my Chinese colleagues. They felt almost kidnapped by it, in the sense that they were locked into this situation where, of course, China wanted the resource. That's an obvious point, but was not able to move because the security situation was such that production was very limited, and undoubtedly considerable damage has been sustained by the production facilities. Nonetheless, there's a lot there, and there's a lot underground. There probably are, as all across this part of Africa, there's huge wealth under the ground, unexplored resource streams for potential for mining there, which just simply is not possible given the security situation at the moment. The government has been mortgaging its oil resources in advance, so it's been taking out loans and misusing finance, misusing that money. Well, that is the judgment call, misusing, but presumably funding expenditure on arms and other areas. But selling the oil forward. So that is a dangerous economic game. So a lot to put right, and I just hope we can look forward one day to a country which has got a sort of settled and transparent degree of control over its own resources, that it's not being exploited by anyone, but that it is able to trade and able to bring in the revenue it will need. Probably less from oil than has been predicted, but there are no doubt other things under the ground which could be looked at.
Right, Andrew?
I think for me, I slightly disagree with Tim on the protecting lives with the UN, because my own personal experience has been one where I don't feel the UN has always been as robust as it claims it was, particularly during the Malakal attacks, but there are other attacks which have taken place, or UN staff have been kidnapped, national staff have been kidnapped. And so for me, I think the protection role, I think, is one where it looks the part but doesn't necessarily play the part. And if there was to be an outbreak of conflict, I don't think I don't think the UN would have the capacity or the ability to be able to deal with that instantly, because it is slow to react. I think its strength really lies in the systems that it does when it works with local capacity, in the sense of trying to strengthen local governments, trying to strengthen more people on the ground, trying to get them to form projects, small programs. Those sort of things is where that mission in particular has its strengths. With DDR, I mean, forget about it. It can't handle it. It doesn't have the skills or the capabilities to do that. With the natural resources question, Sort of agree with Tim on this one. I think the problem with the natural resources is, as Tim has said, if you keep on sort of expecting that you will have a certain amount of income over a certain period of time and loaning things out without actually having some sort of long-term fiscal plan, then you run the risk of really damaging the economy. I mean, the economies are actually broken as it is, but long-term you just hamper that. So, so much more news.
Nina?
No, I think it's pretty much well covered.
Okay.
Can I just a quick thing? I think in the peace agreement there is actually some language on natural resources and looking after them along the lines of a sort of sovereign wealth fund. It's one of much of the peace agreement which has not been reached yet. And on the UN, I agree. I'm being as positive.
Sorry, would anyone else like to pose any questions? Yes, we'll begin, gentleman at the back, and then more questions. Okay, we'll begin with you, sir.
Anthony Xavier, UK Joint Force Headquarters. I just had a question noting the points about not a requirement for longer-term planning. What's the prediction for what's actually going to happen at the end of the 100-day deadline? Are we expecting any tangible outcomes? Is there still risk of violence? Could there be another extension?
Great, thank you. Let's go the other way. Nina, would you like to start and then move down the panel?
So we're currently 26 days in the 100-day extension, and so far we've seen actually little happening. There's no really progress on the cantonment process. Kira and Makjar were expected to meet today in Juba, but was again delayed to tomorrow because Hemeti, the RSF commander, currently part of the transitional government in Sudan, was supposed to accompany him, but because of a busy agenda, they had to postpone to tomorrow. So we've seen, within the 26 days, little progress. I think it's likely that there will be, there are really two scenarios. There will be another delay, but I think the international community, increasingly grown fed up with the constant delays in the process, might not be too keen on supporting that. Or the second part could really be that Kiir goes ahead anyways and forms a transitional government without Machar, which is also, of course, a very risky scenario.
He can't though, because technically this new, and this is not countering Nina's comment, but so the new agreement actually states Riek as the vice president, so there cannot be any transitional government without Riek. I mean, the two go hand in hand. It's not like the previous agreement where it didn't have that, which is why he put Taban Deng in that situation. I think you're going to see further delays. This is a tactic that, unfortunately, if you know South Sudan, you just get used to, and it's a shame because I think there's an opportunity in a window for them to get the support they need to move things forward. But I think what will end up happening is that people just become really disconnected with South Sudan and just say, you know what, we can't be bothered. And then it becomes a situation where you have all-out violence, which is still likely, and then people then start to react. And I think that's possibly more the scenario that I would see happening. And I hate to say that, but that is sort of the situation that led up to the 2013 attacks, 2016. Most of us who were there saw things bubbling up, and no one really reacted until it really hit the crap hit the fan, as they say.
Yeah, I just say, I mean, I'm not as close to it as colleagues are, but the pattern of that is, I think there are characters there who will play around with the agreement, and they will delay and they will try to get their own things through. I certainly would hope that the international community is ready for that situation and will remain engaged. I mean, there is one of my single worst nightmares was that we and some of the other bigger countries, the US and others, would actually disengage. Because it doesn't bear thinking about, I think, what might happen, which will be even worse than what we have at the moment. The exercise of the international community being there to just keep watch, I think does actually, you can actually count it in lies. And so it's not that I'm not worried about that scenario, I am worried about it, but I think we've been there often enough to know that we have to stay engaged, which of course gives the people who want to play around with the agreement endless opportunities to do so.
But just a quick point on that as well. I think the other biggest problem that you can have agreements and you can say, okay, we're going to do this in this period of time and we're going to sort this out. But I think the other thing that people neglect to remember, that a lot of these things, whether it's reintegration, demobilization, whether it's integrating the peace agreement into the constitution, these things take time. And I think what people are not forgetting is that there are all of these different agreements, different understandings of how you do these different processes that are not factored into the time frame that is given. So, for example, this transitional army must be formed in 100 days. I mean, there is nowhere in any planet that has ever been done. I mean, in Nepal, where I worked before, it took the best part of almost 5 years for that to work. Integrated troops as part of the, and we're expecting these guys to do it in 100 days. It's not realistic. And so I think we are setting South Sudan up for failure when we do that, because it's not just the deadlines. I think the deadlines is one thing, but it's also saying, well, the current agreement hasn't even been agreed in the national constitution. So even if this whole thing happens in the next 76 days, the agreement is not enshrined in the constitution. And so that means the president can still override stuff that is part of the agreement, but actually is not in the constitution, because legally he has the right to do that. But we've not thought about that. And that in itself brings up a whole, bag of worms as well. So it's, again, it's realistic steps, but also bearing in mind that these things are not done overnight.
I see. Okay, we have two questions, so I'm going to take these at once. You first, Sarah, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, my name's Lucian Harron and I work with Safer World. I'd love to take liberties and ask a few questions, but how many will stay around?
You're allowed one for now, and then we'll come back to you if we have more time.
Okay. In which case, I'd like to pick up on something that Andrew's just mentioned, which is about the reality of what's happening in South Sudan and the politics of South Sudan versus the formality of the agreement. The agreement is many, many pages, and very detailed, and includes provisions which are ambitious or apparently not what the parties actually want. And a great example of that is that the government of South Sudan signed a sort of multi-million-dollar lobbying contract with a lobbying firm run by, sadly, a former US ambassador to, I think it was Kenya, to enhance their access to Trump, and also one of the objectives was to prevent the hybrid court, which is something that they signed in their agreement to be established. They're paying lobbyists to try and prevent that from ever happening. So I think it's a great example of querying. On the one hand, we have this so-called agreement, which they've definitely signed, and on the other hand, we have sort of the reality of the politics there. And so I'm curious to hear a bit more about what you think the real functions of the agreement are, in terms of the way in which politics and security are negotiated and practiced between the parties. What's the real dynamic at play, if that question is clear, and if there's more time, I'd like to raise a couple of other.
Great, thank you. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, in 2015, the peace agreement literally fell because there was a lack of funds. The government didn't have sufficient funds. Clearly, we can see a reoccurrence here where literally to push it, to nudge it to getting a transitional government, the government doesn't have money to pay for the process. Yet the international community doesn't want to donate anything. Doesn't want to also learn from the recent history, because even if they're going now, there's no finance in the country, there's another recipe for war. So historically there has been various fundings, and why not now? Because really South Sudan needs help, even more now than even before. And in as much as we're lacking capacity, we also feel finance is necessary to get this thing moving. So why is the international community sort of ignoring that factor? And if we really are committed to peace and saving South Sudanese lives, then some element of finance has to be done. Mechanisms can be done to protect it, because we fear that it's going to be drained or diverted, but surely money is needed to push this peace process.
Absolutely. Tim, we'll begin with you.
Okay, let's be blunt about this. I mean, you touched on the real politics behind the agreement. I remember distinctly in 2015, yes, August, when the peace agreement was signed after 2 years, after a year and a half of discussion. And the President Salva Kiir, came up with various objections at the last minute, but signed. So injected ambivalence into an agreement. So taking, he was trying to take the opportunity that I'm not going to implement this and not to implement that. So a lack of commitment all the way through. The story you tell about the lobbyist, I find that shameful, but that's just a personal opinion. Absolutely right. The hybrid court was agreed. The hybrid court was not the ICC recommendation. It was completely sat on by the African Union itself, who took no action at all. It was their one action point in the South Sudan agreement, and there was no action. I remember when the new Secretary General came to Juba just before I left, asking him in public about this, and I didn't seem to know the answer. But we knew the answer. It's basically that it's just sitting on a shelf. But absolutely, the government working against agreed articles in the agreement, and not just the government either, all the parties, trying to actually unpick and subvert the agreement they'd all signed. That was just the reality of the politics of it. On funding, I don't have much sympathy with this, I'm afraid. The international community has poured money into South Sudan. It's not going to it's not going to give funding to the government for accountability reasons. It does fund, and this country, the United States, other countries fund the peace process itself and the various mechanisms quite generously. We staff them and make sure they work. This is an excuse. It's an excuse for inaction. Setting up or following the terms of the agreement doesn't, or most of them don't actually cost much. It's a question of political will and political actions. And the protagonists know perfectly well that if they started taking those political actions, they would start getting enough credibility to attract funding. So there is no basis to make that request. In my very last meeting of JMEC, the group there, and we had all the various leaders there, and I tried to say something that I was leaving, and said how sorry I was that everything was such a disaster. And one of the things I did was said, "What are we listening to?" Well, it was a socking great big helicopter flying over. The cost of putting a helicopter up in the sky would pay for a large amount of these provisions. What's that helicopter doing? It's going off to do something unmentionable to people. So there is money, there was money, and it's going to the wrong place. And this is absolutely, clear to the international community sitting there. So the idea that we would come up with funding and food and to run a sort of restaurant service for these assembly points, that's not going to happen. And I'm sorry to be speaking quite forcibly on it, but it was something that was put to us the whole time. Just can't we have a bit more money? Well, no, actually. There is funding for a properly implemented peace agreement.
Andrew?
I think on the latter point, Justin's question, my personal views on this. I think there's one thing to. Yes, I agree that there needs to be more funding towards certain aspects, but I think it also. I think the problem that we have is, as Tim has rightly mentioned, is that the accountability hasn't been there, particularly for the leaders. And I'm going to read you one fact, which on some numbers that recently came up, that Parliament recommended cutting 10% of its peace fund to help pay for the new presidential jet, and a $50,000 healthcare plan for each lawmaker. And it's those sort of things that I think don't help the situation. And I can list. I mean, there's the report came out this week, but it's just things like that I think actually it's more accountability that is required and needed. And actually, as you know, as we've had personal conversations, I would actually argue that maybe now is the time for a technocratic government to actually come in and take over South Sudan. It's not the conventional thing. People might throw stones at me, but I just think the leaders are not getting it right. And I think people are suffering too much now.
Nina, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would again really like to underline what my colleagues just said. I was going to name the same fact as Andrew just mentioned on the private jet. Also earlier this year, $135,000 from the budget meant for the implementation of the peace agreement was used for the reconstruction of houses for prospective vice presidents in the transitional government. And I think additionally, it's also the lack of transparency about the money that is being put in. I mentioned earlier that Kiir had committed $100 million to the implementation of the peace agreement. $40 million has been released. However, the National Pre-Transitional Council was not able to answer the questions where this money was spent on. And if then reports emerge as well of heavily that cantonment sites like basic services, one really wonders where the 40 million actually went to. So I think that the government also really has to demonstrate there is money, we're spending money on it, and this is where it's going. So increases transparency around it as well.
Great, thank you. I think we are unfortunately out of time. I know a few of you had unanswered questions, so please feel free to come up and speak to the panel afterwards. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Please do keep an eye on our website for future events coming up. We have a few good ones coming up over the rest of the month, and please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you.